The silence here is different. In Washington, silence was just a pause between sirens, a temporary gap in the chaos. But here in the Yukon, silence is a physical weight. It presses down on your chest, heavy as the 6 feet of snow that buries the world. It has been 6 months since I walked away from the burning wreckage of Senator Clay's empire. 6 months of trying to freeze the memories out of my head. We live in a cabin that was old when the gold rush started. No electricity. No internet. Just wood, fire, and the biting wind. Duke is no longer the wounded animal I carried out of Oak Haven. He is a wolf in a dog's skin now. We have a routine. Chop wood, check the traps. Survive. It's a simple life, but I should have known better. Peace is a rented luxury for men like me. It started on a Tuesday. I was splitting logs when Duke stopped. He didn't bark. He just stood up, the fur on his back rising in a jagged ridge. A low, guttural vibration started in his chest. I lowered the axe. I know that look. That's the something is wrong look. I grabbed the lever action rifle leaning against the woodpile. What is it? Boy, I whispered. We walked for a mile into the density of the pines. The light was fading fast. Then I saw it. A splash of color in a world of monochrome white. Red. Bright. Arterial read. It wasn't an animal kill. It was a drag mark. Someone had been bleeding, and someone else had been dragging them. We followed the trail to a ravine. Down below, next to a wrecked snowmobile, was a body. A girl, maybe 20 years old. She was alive, but barely. Her pulse was like a dying bird. I scooped her up. She was dangerously light. But as I turned to climb back up, I heard it. The high-pitched whine of engines, snowmobiles, moving fast. The hunters were coming to finish the job. I scrambled up the ravine, my lungs burning. The whine of the engines grew louder, an angry swarm of hornets closing in. I pushed through the deep snow, shielding her from the branches. We had to beat them to the cabin. We reached the cabin just as the headlights cut through the trees. I laid the girl by the fire and killed the lights. Through the window scope, I saw them. 3 riders in white winter camouflage, carrying military-grade rifles. Locals don't carry suppressed weapons. They fanned out, flanking the cabin. Professional. I cracked the window open, aligning my sights. "Wrong house, gentlemen," I whispered. I didn't want a war, but looking at the battered girl, I felt that old fire ignite. I took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. The shot shattered the night. They retreated, dragging their wounded leader away. But I knew this wasn't a victory. It was just the opening move. The frozen rail had begun. The adrenaline faded, leaving only the cold and the crackle of the wood stove. I spent the next hour acting as a field medic. The girl had broken ribs and severe frostbite on her fingers, but the bleeding was from a graze wound on her thigh. She was lucky, or maybe unlucky, to be alive in a place like this. Duke lay beside her, his body heat acting as a living radiator. Around midnight, she gasped awake. Her eyes were wild, scanning the dark corners of the cabin, her hands clawing for a weapon that wasn't there. "Easy," I said, stepping into the firelight with a mug of hot broth. "You're safe. They're gone." She looked at me, then at Duke. The panic slowly drained from her face, replaced by a hollow, haunted look I had seen on 1,000 soldiers. "They never leave," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry ice. "Kruger never leaves. Kruger." The name didn't mean anything to me, but the fear in her eyes told me everything. She told me her name was NEA. She was part of a shipment human cargo being moved across the border where the satellites don't look. She had escaped from a transport truck 10 miles east. She pulled down the collar of her parka. There on her neck was a tattoo, a stylized, geometric wolf's head. "It's not just a gang," she said. "It's an army. They own the border." I walked to the window. The snow was falling harder now, erasing the blood, erasing the tracks. But it couldn't erase the fact that I had shot one of their men. They weren't just coming back for her anymore. They were coming back for blood. I checked my ammo reserves. 3 boxes of rifle rounds, 2 magazines for the pistol. Wasn't enough for an army. If we were going to survive the night, I had to turn this cabin into a fortress. I went to the shed and grabbed everything I could use. Propane tanks, rusted nails, fishing wire, and road flares. I spent the next 2 hours in the freezing dark, rigging the perimeter. I created a kill box in the clearing A zone where they would be forced to enter, and where I could unleash hell. I buried the propane tanks under the snow at the tree line, wiring them to a manual detonator I made from a car battery. It was crude. It was dangerous. But it was the only advantage I had. Duke watched me work, his yellow eyes tracking my every move. He knew the game. We were hunting again. When I finished, I sat on the porch, rifle across my lap, watching the white void. They didn't make the same mistake twice. They didn't come on snowmobiles. At 3 o'clock a.m., the ground began to tremble. Not a vibration, but a quake. Duke growled, backing up towards the door. I looked through the scope. Cutting through the blizzard, blindingly bright LED bars turned the night into day. It was a snowcat, a massive, tracked all-terrain vehicle armored like a tank. Behind it, a dozen figures on foot, moving in a tactical sweep. They brought heavy machinery to a knife fight. NEA screamed from inside the cabin. "It's Kruger." I racked the slide of the rifle. The trap was set, but I hadn't planned for a tank. "Duke," I said, my voice steady. "Inside. Guard NEA." I stepped out onto the porch, the freezing wind whipping my face. The lights of the snowcat fell on me. I was the only thing standing between them and the girl, and I was ready to burn it all down. The world had shrunk down to the size of my thumb resting on the detonator switch. The snowcat roared like a prehistoric beast, its tracks churning the pristine snow into a slurry of mud and ice. The LED light bars mounted on its roof were blinding, turning the falling snowflakes into a wall of white static, making it impossible to see the men moving behind it. But I didn't need to see them. I could feel them. I knew exactly how they moved, using the massive vehicle as a mobile shield, stepping in its tracks, waiting for the suppression fire to start. My breath was coming in slow, controlled clouds of steam, freezing against the wool of my scarf. I could hear Renier whimpering, a sound of pure terror that cut through the mechanical growl of the engine. Duke was silent, his body pressed against the door, a coiled spring of muscle and instinct waiting for my command. I watched the beast crush the invisible line I had marked with a dead pine branch earlier that day. 10 yards. 5 yards. They were entering the kill box. The ground shook beneath my boots, vibrating through the wood of the porch, rattling the windows in their frames. It was a display of arrogance. They thought this was just a mop-up operation. They thought they weren't rushing a bug. They had no idea they were walking into a graveyard. I let them get comfortable. I let them think they had the upper hand. I waited until the snowcat was dead center in the clearing, its massive steel plow pushing a wave of snow over the buried propane tanks. The driver revved the engine, a mechanical scream of dominance. That was my cue. I tightened my grip on the switch. "Welcome to the Yukon," I whispered, the cold air burning my throat. The night didn't just break, it shattered. The ground erupted with a violence that defied nature. The 3 propane tanks I had buried along the tree line didn't just explode, they vaporized the snow, sending a shockwave of superheated gas and shrapnel tearing through the clearing. For a split second, the blizzard was replaced by a towering wall of orange and black fire that reached for the sky. The concussion hit me a fraction of a second later, a physical hammer blow that knocked the wind out of my lungs and rattled my teeth. Even from the porch, the heat was intense, stinging my eyebrows. But the devastation downrange was absolute. The snowcat, that unstoppable iron beast, was actually lifted, off its front tracks by the force of the blast. It slammed back down with a bone-jarring crash that echoed through the valley like a thunderclap. The explosion had shredded its right track, leaving the metal links hanging like a broken spine. The men behind it weren't so lucky. The blast wave had caught them in the open. I didn't wait for the smoke to clear. I raised the lever-action rifle, the stock pressing familiarly against my bruised shoulder. The firelight illuminated the chaos perfectly. Silhouettes were scrambling, coughing, trying to find cover in a world that was suddenly burning. I cycled the action crack. My first shot took down a mercenary trying to flank the left side. Crack, boom. The second shot sparked off the snowcat's armored windshield, spider webbing the glass. This wasn't a defense anymore. This was a counterattack. I was pouring fire into the smoke, controlling the chaos, making them pay for every inch of ground. But even broken, the beast wasn't dead. The turret on top of the snowcat spun around, the heavy barrel of a .50 caliber machine gun locking onto my position. The sound of a .50 caliber machine gun is distinct. It's not a bang, it's a rhythmic, thumping pressure that you feel in your chest. Thump, 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 thump. The first burst through the front of the cabin as if it were made of paper. Logs splintered and exploded, sending razor-sharp shards of wood flying through the living room. I threw myself flat on the deck, covering my head as the air above me filled with latent death. The glass windows shattered inward, showering any eye and Duke with debris. The snowcat was immobilized, but it had turned into a stationary pillbox, its heavy gun suppressing everything in sight. Load to the back, I screamed over the roar of the gun. I crawled back inside the ruined cabin. It was a nightmare of dust, smoke, and freezing wind. NEA was curled into a ball under the heavy oak table, Duke barking furiously at the invisible enemy. The front wall was disintegrating under the heavy fire. We couldn't stay here. The propane trap had bought us time, but it hadn't stopped them. I could hear shouting outside the survivors were a group. They were moving up, using the burning trees as cover. They were angry, and they were professional. They would flank us within minutes. I grabbed a Molotov cocktail, just a whiskey bottle filled with kerosene and a rag that I had prepped on the counter. I needed to create a wall of fire to block their line of sight. I crawled to the shattered window. Risking my head, I lit the rag, the smell of kerosene mixing with the cordite, and hurled it with everything I had towards the snowcat's engine block. It smashed against the metal grill, liquid fire splashing over the intake vents. The machine gun stopped for a second, the gunner distracted by the flames licking at his viewport. That was our only chance. The cabin, my sanctuary, my home for the last 6 months, was dying. The roof had caught fire from the tracers, and thick black smoke was filling the small space, choking us. We had to leave. Now, I hauled NEA to her feet. She was coughing, her eyes streaming, terror making her legs weak. We run, I told her, grabbing her shoulders hard enough to bruise. We run, or we die. Do you understand? She nodded. A jerky, fragile movement. I kicked open the back door, the one facing the steep slope of the mountain, away from the kill box. The blizzard had intensified, a whiteout that reduced visibility to 0. Perfect. Nature was giving us a cloak. Duke, lead. I commanded. The dog didn't hesitate. He plunged into the waist-deep snow, carving a path for us. We stumbled out into the freezing void. The heat of the burning cabin instantly replaced by a cold so sharp it felt like knives on my skin. I didn't look back at the flames devouring my life. I didn't look back at the bodies in the snow. I kept my hand on NEA's parka, dragging her forward, one agonizing step at a time. Behind us, I heard shouting, then the crack of rifles, but the shots were wild. They couldn't see us. We were ghosts again, vanishing into the white static of the storm. But we were exposed. No shelter, no heat. And Kruger's army was still behind us, wounded and bloodthirsty. The night was far from over. We weren't escaping, we were just moving the battlefield deeper into hell. The storm wasn't just weather anymore, it was a living, breathing predator trying to swallow us whole. We had been walking stumbling, really for what felt like hours, but my watch said it had only been 40 minutes. The temperature had dropped to something abstract. A number so low it ceased to matter. Cold is deceptive. At first, it hurts. It stings your exposed skin like 1,000 needles, makes your joints ache, makes your lungs burn. But then, the pain fades. That's the danger. That's the White Death. You start to feel warm. You start to feel sleepy. You want to just sit down in the soft snow and close your eyes for a moment. I knew the symptoms. I knew that if we stopped moving for more than a minute, we would never stand up again. NEA was stumbling every few steps. I had practically been carrying her. My arm locked around her waist like an iron bar. She was mumbling things that didn't make sense, calling out for her mother, talking about the summer sun. Her mind was breaking under the thermal stress. "Stay with me, NEA," I shouted, but the wind tore the words from my mouth before they could reach her ears. I couldn't feel my own toes inside my boots. My tactical gloves were stiff with ice. Navigation was impossible. The world was a void of swirling white. Up was down. Left was right. We were walking blind in a freezer, and I knew that without shelter, we were dead men walking. Then Duke stopped. He was 10 feet ahead, a gray ghost in the storm. He barked once, sharp and demanding. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking at a dark fissure in the rock face that I hadn't even seen. It wasn't a cave, not really. It was a fracture in the granite, a deep geological wound in the side of the mountain caused by centuries of ice expansion. But right now, it looked like the gates of heaven. I dragged NEA through the narrow opening, scraping my shoulders against the jagged rock. Duke squeezed in after us, shaking the snow from his coat in a cloud of mist. The wind stopped instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. We were out of the bite of the gale, but we were now in absolute darkness. It was a tomb-like blackness that pressed against your eyes. I fumbled for my emergency chem light, the last one I had. I cracked it, and a sickly green glow illuminated our sanctuary. The walls were coated in thick sheets of ice, looking like the teeth of some massive beast. The floor was uneven rock. It was freezing, but it was dry, and the wind couldn't reach us here. I moved NEA to the back of the recess, wrapping her in the emergency foil blanket from my medkit. It crinkled loudly in the silence. She was shivering violently now, her body convulsing as the blood rushed back to her core. This was the critical moment. I huddled next to her, pulling Duke in close on the other side. "Body heat," I whispered. "We share it." We became a pile of shivering light in the green dark. I checked my weapon. The action was frozen shut. If they found us now, I couldn't even fire a shot. I had to strip the weapon and clean the ice from the firing pin in the dark, with fingers that felt like blocks of wood. Hours passed. The shivering slowly subsided as the collective heat of two humans and a wolf formed a small pocket of air. Enia's breathing stabilized. She was tough, I'll give her that. Most people would have shattered by now. She sat up, pulling the foil blanket tighter around her shoulders, her face ghostly in the chemical light. Why? I asked. It was the only question that mattered. Why did Kruger bring a tank for one girl? Why burn down a forest for you? She hesitated, looking at the ice. Then she reached into her boot and pulled out a small, waterproof doctor. I'm not just cargo, Marcus. I was their accountant. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. She wasn't a victim, she was a defector. Kruger isn't just a smuggler. He's a contractor. He moves weapons, intel, and people for governments that want to keep their hands clean. I stole his ledger. Every transaction, every bribe, every name for the last 10 years. Names that could topple regimes. I looked at the drive. It was smaller than a lighter, yet it weighed more than the mountain above us. That's why they were desperate. That's why they were sloppy. They couldn't let this leave the wilderness. We weren't just surviving a storm anymore, we were protecting a nuclear bomb of information. And I realized then that my war with the senator in Washington was just a skirmish compared to this. I had stepped into the middle of a global shadow war. I must have dozed off for a few minutes, a dangerous mistake. I was snapped awake by Duke. He wasn't growling, he was whining. A high-pitched sound of anxiety. He was pressed against the cave entrance, looking out. The storm had broken. The wind was gone. I crawled to the opening and peered out. The sun was rising, painting the snow in brilliant, blinding shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful, and it was deadly, because against that clear blue sky, I saw it. A drone, not a small consumer toy, but a military-grade surveillance drone, buzzing like a giant insect about a mile out. It was flying a grid pattern, its thermal cameras scanning the ground for heat signatures. We were safe inside the rock, masked by the cold stone, but the moment we stepped out, we would light up on their screens like a flare. We were trapped. If we stayed, we froze or starved. If we left, Kruger's missiles would turn us into pink mist before we took 10 steps. I looked back at any eye in the drive. We needed a plan. We needed to move without being seen. And looking at the sheer drop of the cliff face below us, I realized the only way out wasn't across the snow. It was down, into the valley where the trees were thickest. But to get there, we would have to slide down the mountain in plain sight of the Devil's Eye. We couldn't stay in the cave. To stay was to die a slow, cold death. To leave was to invite a quick, violent one. I chose the latter. At least on the move, you have a chance. I tied a length of paracord around Annie's waist and secured it to my tactical belt. Don't look up, I told her. Just look at my boots. Step where I step. We stepped out of the shadow of the mountain and onto the exposed face of the slope. The sun was blinding, reflecting off the millions of ice crystals like a sea of diamonds. We were to black specks on a pristine white canvas, the most obvious targets in the world. Above us, the drone stopped its grid search. It hovered, rotating on its axis. It had seen us. I didn't need a radar detector to know that a laser designator was currently painting the target on my chest. I expected a missile. I expected the whistle of incoming death. But Kruger wanted the drive. He couldn't vaporize us. Not yet. He needed to pin us down until his ground team could get up here. I saw the snowcats far below, moving like beetles at the tree line. They were firing mortars, not to kill, but to hurt us. Thump. Whump. The first round impacted 50 yards to our left, throwing up a geyser of snow and rock. The shockwave destabilized the powder under my boots. We were walking on a loaded gun. The snowpack here was deep, unstable, and resting on a layer of slick ice. Every explosion was vibrating the mountain's spine. I looked at the peak above us, heavy with accumulated snow. They were firing blindly, arrogant in their power. They didn't realize they weren't just shooting at us, they were knocking on the door of a sleeping giant. The second mortar round hit closer, showering us with ice shards. NEA screamed, slipping and sliding 10 feet down before the rope snapped taut, nearly pulling me off the ledge. I dug my boots in, my muscles screaming as I hauled her back up. Move, I roared. We have to reach the ridge. But we weren't going to make it. The third shell didn't hit near us. It hit the cornice, the overhanging lip of snow at the very peak of the mountain, 1,000 feet above our heads. There was a sound then, not an explosion. It was deeper, more primal. It sounded like the earth itself was cracking open. C-R-A-C-K. A sound so loud it vibrated in my teeth. I looked up. The entire top of the mountain was moving. It wasn't falling, it was flowing. A white wave, hundreds of feet high, was detaching from the peak. The mortar fire had broken the tension. The avalanche had begun. The drone pilot realized his mistake too late. The drone tried to pull up, but the air pressure change from the collapsing face swatted it out of the sky like a fly. I looked at NEA. There was no time to run, no time to climb. The physics were simple. Millions of tons of snow were accelerating towards us at 100 miles an hour. We were about to be erased. I spotted a large rock outcropping, a shark's fin of granite jutting out of the slope 20 yards away. Duke, NEA, the rock. I unclipped the rope and tackled her, sliding, scrambling, clawing our way towards the only solid thing in a world that had turned liquid. We hit the lee side of the rock just as the world ended. I shoved NEA into the small crevice between the granite and the mountain face, throwing Duke in on top of her, and then curled my own body over them like a shield. I jammed my hands into the cracks of the rock and held on. Then the light went out. The roar was deafening. It wasn't just wind, it was the sound of 1,000 freight trains screaming directly over our heads. The air was sucked out of my lungs. The pressure was immense. Chunks of ice the size of cars smashed against the other side of our rock shelter, shaking the mountain to its core. The snow flowed over us like a river of concrete. It filled my nose, my mouth, my ears. It packed into every gap in my clothing. I felt the weight pressing down, trying to crush my ribs, trying to rip me away from the rock. I held on. I held on until my fingers bled, until my mind went blank with terror. I thought about the senator. I thought about the fire in Washington. I thought about how ironic it was to burn down a city only to die frozen in the middle of nowhere. time lost all meaning. It could have been a minute, it could have been an hour. The roaring slowly faded to a rumble, then a hiss, and then nothing. Absolute, suffocating silence. We were buried, but we were alive. Darkness, cold. The air was stale and limited. I was pinned. The snow had cemented around my legs and back, locking me in place like a statue. I tested my arms. My right arm was free, shielded by the overhang of the rock. I reached out. I felt for Duke. He was alive. I felt a hand gripping my jacket. NEA, alive. Don't panic, I whispered, though the sound was swallowed by the snow. Breathe slowly. Conserve oxygen. I began to dig. Not frantically, but methodically. I used my tactical knife to chip away at the packed ice in front of my face. I pushed the debris behind me, making a small pocket of space, inch by inch, minute by minute. My hands were numb, my body hypothermic, but the soldier in me refused to quit. Dig, push, breathe, push, breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the tip of my knife punched through into something soft, light. A tiny beam of sunlight pierced the darkness, blindingly bright. I widened the hole and punched my fist through the surface. I pulled myself out, gasping, sucking in the freezing, sweet air. I looked around. The landscape was unrecognizable. The trees were gone. The tracks were gone. The drone was gone. The mortar crews below were likely buried under 50 feet of debris. The mountain had wiped the slate clean. I pulled any Iron Duke out of our tomb. We stood there shivering, battered, on top of the devastation. Kruger's army had been decimated by their own arrogance. Nature had fought my battle for me. But as I looked down at the valley floor, I saw one black speck moving on the white expanse. A snowcat. Damaged, but moving. Kruger survived. And now, there was nothing between us but open snow. The avalanche had redrawn the map, burying the forest under millions of tons of white concrete. But it had spared the lake. Down in the basin, the frozen surface of Lake Bennett stretched out for miles, a flat, desolate expanse of black ice dusted with wind-bound snow. It looked peaceful, like a polished mirror reflecting the indifferent sky, but I knew better. Ice is alive. It shifts, it groans, and it waits for a mistake. We limped down the debris field, sliding over uprooted trees and crushed boulders. NEA was barely conscious, her movements jerky and mechanical. Duke was limping too, favoring his front left paw, but his eyes were locked on the one thing that marred the perfection of the ice. Kruger's snowcat. The avalanche had battered it, stripping away its radar dish and crushing one of its side panels. But the beast was still moving. It sat in the middle of the lake, engine idling, a dark predator waiting for us to step into the open. There was no cover, no trees, no rocks, just a mile of open ice between us and the Canadian border on the other side. To get to safety, we had to cross the killing ground. Kruger knew it. He wasn't hunting us anymore, he was waiting for us. I looked at the vast, frozen sheet. It was thick enough to hold a man, maybe even a moose. But was it thick enough to hold a tent on armored vehicle after the shockwaves of an avalanche had compromised its integrity? I checked my rifle. Empty. My pistol. 2 rounds. I had no explosives left. No tricks. Just the environment. Stay close, I told NEA. Walk softly. We are walking on glass. We made it 200 yards out when the external speakers of the snowcat crackled to life. The sound decoed off the surrounding mountains, distorted and metallic, like the voice of a god demanding sacrifice. End of the line, soldier, Kruger's voice boomed. You fought well. Better than I expected. But look around you. There is nowhere to run. The border is 5 miles away. You'll freeze before you get halfway. The turret of the snowcat traversed slowly, the barrel of the heavy machine gun locking onto us. He didn't fire. He wanted the drive. He wanted to win completely. Leave the girl. Leave the drive. Walk away, Kruger lied. He'll let you live. I stopped walking. I looked down at the ice beneath my boots. It was black deep, and laced with spitter-bear fractures from the earlier explosions. I could hear it singing that high-pitched ping-ping-ping sound that tells you the tension is at a breaking point. I looked at the snowcat. It was heavy, massive, and it was sitting on a pressure ridge. Kruger was a smuggler, a killer, a businessman. But he wasn't a man of the wild. He didn't know how to read the ice. He saw a highway, I saw a trapdoor. I knelt down, pretending to surrender. But I was actually feeling the vibrations. NEA, I whispered, not moving my lips. Take Duke. Move perpendicular to the shore. Do not run. Slide your feet. Get to the tree line. She looked at me, tears freezing on her cheeks. Go, I ordered. I stood up slowly, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out the drive, or rather, a Zippo lighter that looked like it from a distance. I held it up to the sun. You want it? I shouted, my voice raw. Come and get it. Kruger took the bait. He saw the girl and the dog moving away, but he didn't care. He saw me standing alone in the center of the lake, holding the only thing that could destroy his life. The engine of the snowcat roared, a cloud of black exhaust spewing into the crystal air. The track spit into the ice, throwing up sprays of slush. He wasn't going to shoot me. He wanted to crush me. He wanted the satisfaction of driving 10 tons of steel over the man who burned his operation to the ground. I stood my ground. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence. The ice beneath me groaned, a deep, resonant bass note that vibrated through my bones. Come on, I thought. Come on, you heavy son of a bitch. The vehicle gathered speed. 30 miles an hour. 40. It was a wall of metal closing in. At 50 yards, I could see Kruger's face in the viewport, twisted in a grin of triumph. At 40 yards, the ice started to bow. Water began to seep up through the cracks around my boots. I waited, discipline. It's not about being fearless, it's about controlling the fear until the math works. At 20 yards, the nose of the snowcat dipped slightly. The ice plate was failing. Now, I didn't run away from it. I ran towards it, then threw myself into a baseball slide to the right, my body skimming over the slick surface like a curling stone. The snowcat tried to correct, to turn and follow me. That was the killing blow. The lateral force of the turn combined with the weight was too much. The sound wasn't a crash. It was a scream, the scream of metal twisting on dice shattering. The front of the snowcat plunged through the surface, diving into the freezing black water below. The momentum carried the rear up into the air, the tracks spinning helplessly against the sky. For a second, it hung there, poised between worlds before gravity won. The vehicle slid backward into the dark hole it had made, vanishing with a violently bubbling gurgle. I slid to a stop 50 feet away, gasping for air, clutching my side. I watched the hole in the ice. The water churned black and oily. Bubbles rose to the surface, popping in the cold air. Then, silence. The lake reclaimed its own. Kruger was gone. The army was gone. The threat was entombed under 6 inches of ice and 100 feet of water. I lay there on my back, looking up at the perfect, indifferent blue sky. I started to laugh. It was a painful, wheezing sound, but it was real. I was alive. I rolled over and saw N.E.I.N. Duke standing at the edge of the tree line. Duke barked, a joyous sound that echoed across the valley. I stood up, my legs shaking, and began the long, slow walk towards them. We were battered. We were frozen. We were homeless again. But as I looked at the drive in N.E.A.'s hand, the real drive I knew, we held the power to burn down not just a cabin, but the entire corrupt system that created men like Kruger. The frozen rail ended here, but the war was just warming up.